An important domino has fallen for Auburn this offseason, giving the Tigers a little bit more clarity on their roster situation heading into 2023-24. Wendell Green Jr., who's been on Auburn's roster for the past 2 years after transferring from Eastern Kentucky, he was the Tigers' starting point guard this past season and earned second-team All-SEC accolades, is on his way to the pros. Wendell Green announced on Sunday afternoon that he is turning pro, entering the NBA draft process. A reminder that players have until May 31st to pull out of the draft process. You've seen this with Auburn guys in the past. Most recently, Alan Flanagan last season entered the draft. Dylan Cardwell did as well. It was pretty clear they didn't necessarily have intentions of staying in. They weren't necessarily draftable players at the time, didn't really have much of a prospect for the NBA draft. But in terms of Wendell Green, I think you're seeing a situation that's a lot more like Jared Harper a few years ago for Auburn. He's given all he can at the college level, sort of shown everything he can at the college level, and is now moving on to the next level, feeling like that's the best thing for him in his career. On social media, Wendell Green wrote, quote, "It has been a great honor to play for Auburn University for the past few seasons. Thank you to the coaching and training staff for your guidance, advice, and leadership. I would also like to thank my teammates and everyone who has played a role in helping me get to where I am today. I would like to announce that I will be starting my professional career and declaring for the 2023 NBA draft." So that last sentence there makes it read like Wendell is pretty set on turning pro. Like I mentioned, he does have the opportunity of coming back to college, but that's where things have been a little wishy-washy with this situation and why Auburn needed a little bit of clarity on this at the end of the season. Wendell Green obviously could have come back. He could have been a point guard for Auburn again next season, but the Tigers are bringing in Aiden Holloway, a top 30 overall recruit, one of the best signees in program history. He'll obviously be looking for playing time at point guard as well. And then you have Trey Donaldson, who has said that he's no doubt coming back for his sophomore year. Of course, the backup point guard who had a couple good games for Auburn in the NCAA tournament. So it's becoming a bit of a logjam there at the one spot for Auburn. Maybe some decisions that needed to be made, and Wendell Green feeling like didn't want to necessarily share the load with Aiden Holloway next season. And the reason he's not opting to transfer, the reason he is not just going somewhere else in college. Now, granted, he could come back. He could pull out before the May 31st deadline and come back to Auburn, or excuse me, come back to the college level next season. He could come back to Auburn. The reason he's not doing that, and it seems like he's not doing that at the moment, is because, remember, he already transferred from Eastern Kentucky. So unless you're a grad transfer, unless you're transferring as a graduate student, which Wendell is not, he's only been in college for 3 years, you have to get a waiver in order to transfer for the second time. And we've seen some reports in this particular transfer cycle that the NCAA is doubling down a little bit on that in this cycle, not wanting to let second-time transfers move about so freely and get waivers so easily. We've seen it in the past few years. That hasn't been a huge problem for players, but maybe that's getting increased this season. And overall, it would sort of be a tumultuous situation for Wendell Green to kind of navigate the transfer portal again for a second time. Would he go down a level to be immediately eligible? If he wanted to stay on the Division I level, he would have to obviously get a waiver again. And so that would be a difficult situation for him. So this is something where, if he's decided he wants to move on from Auburn, and again, he's given them all he has over the past couple seasons, it feels like this is the smart thing to do for Wendell Green. Turn pro. Obviously, he will now enter the NBA draft process. He will get feedback from scouts, from NBA personnel over the next couple months with the option of returning to school. But this is a situation where a guy like Wendell Green probably doesn't expect to be drafted, that probably doesn't expect to be among the 60 players who are drafted come June, but he does get kind of a head start on his professional career. Again, I put this back a few years ago to somebody like Jared Harper, who probably didn't expect to be drafted either, but he kind of gets a head start, maybe poke around in the G League. You'll have an opportunity to do that. Obviously, Jared Harper is still playing overseas at the moment, and he had a couple NBA opportunities, was on a couple NBA rosters. And so if you're Wendell Green Jr., you feel like now is the time in your career to go ahead and, give that the green light and leave the college level and turn pro. So what does this mean for Auburn's roster next season? Well, at the moment, they now have 4 scholarship spots open for next year. We've seen them poking around the transfer ranks. We'll see how that kind of plays out over the next few weeks as they continue to get some decisions and continue to open up scholarship spots. But they have 4 scholarship spots open at the moment, and that's including Jalen Williams, Alan Flanagan, and Babatunde Akingbola, all of whom have a COVID season they could exercise. That's including all of them being on the roster at the moment, and that's including Aiden Holloway coming in. So they could have even more roster spots. This is really a roster where you look at maybe one more transfer. Remember, Yohan Traore and Chance Westry, they transferred out earlier in the week. A couple highly rated recruits who didn't really play that much at Auburn their freshman seasons. Both of them transferred out. Now you have Wendell leaving. That opens up obviously 3 scholarship spots. You're now at 4 openings at the moment because Zep Jasper was the only player who exhausted his eligibility off of last year's team. That's a lot of room to play with if you're Bruce Pearl and his staff. And again, like I mentioned, we've still yet to get a decision from Jalen Williams. I, at the moment, would expect him to come back for a 5th season. He's a guy who still has a little bit to go in college. He's blossomed over the course of his 4 years at Auburn. Into last season, he had his most efficient offensive season, and it still feels like he's got some room to grow before he turns to the professional ranks. And so he's also maybe an example of a guy who can make more money at the college level, as in an NIL deal than he can turning pro right now. So I think that makes a lot of sense for him to come back. Obviously, Alan Flanagan, the son of assistant coach Wes Flanagan, I think it's maybe more likely that he turns pro, kind of guy. If we were just talking about Wendell Green, sort of the example of given all he has at the college level, shown everything that he has as a college player and is ready to translate that into the professional level. And then Stretch Ekingbola has been a bottom of the bench player. The past few seasons, he is now a graduate at Auburn, so he could go somewhere as a grad transfer, or he could just elect to end his college career. He could come back for a 5th year at Auburn. We'll see if maybe if that's an option for him on this coaching staff, whether that's something they want him to do. So that's still without a decision from those 3 seniors who could all come back for a 5th year at the college level. Auburn still has 4 openings. So, let's say all 3 of those guys decide to leave. You now have 7 openings in terms of scholarship spots for next year's roster. A big reason for that, remember, Auburn served a scholarship limit the past 2 seasons because of its NCAA reparations back at the FBI scandal, back the Chuck Person, Austin Wiley, Denjel Purifoy scandal 5 or 6 years ago. They served a scholarship limit. They were down 1 scholarship the past 2 years. That's why somebody like Leor Berman, who played in the rotation, that's why he didn't get a scholarship. They were at 12 scholarships last season and the season before. Now they're at back up to 13. And so that's a lot of room for Bruce Pearl and his staff to play with in the transfer portal. Like I mentioned, the only incoming player they have right now is Aiden Holloway, top 30 overall recruit, a 4-star, high 4-star point guard, guy who was in the McDonald's All-American game earlier this week. And really had a good showing. I thought from watching that game, he was one of the best players at the event, one of 6 McDonald's All-Americans in program history. So again, that's something where you look at him adding into the point guard equation for Auburn. Maybe makes sense for a guy like Wendell Green to say, look, he had his really good season coming off the bench for Auburn when they won that SEC championship. Then he was 2nd team All-SEC, one of the 3 or 4 best point guards in the SEC. Last year, despite some of his inconsistencies, he was still All-SEC for a reason, 13.7 points per game, 4.1 assists, 1.8 steals, was still one of the better players in the conference overall, and now feeling like he can translate that to the next level with some professional development. And so looking at the point guard situation for Auburn, it would make sense for Aiden Holloway to fill in now as the starter. Trey Donaldson had a great NCAA tournament, a couple games there for Auburn, shot the ball really well from downtown and showed some good progression over his freshman season, a really confident player on both ends of the floor. You're hoping that he can take that next step in his development as a sophomore. And so we'll be looking out for the decisions for Auburn. There could be a couple. I wouldn't be surprised if 1 or 2 more transfers from guys on the roster, maybe guys who want to make professional decisions. Again, I would think at the moment, Alan Flanagan is probably likely to turn pro, whereas Jalen Williams makes more sense to come back. But at the moment, this could be a really different looking roster for Auburn next season. They're putting in a lot of work in the transfer portal, trying to get guys on campus for visits, and maybe one of those includes a point guard. You look at some of kind of the archetype of guys they've been after. A lot of those guys have been 3-point shooters, guys who can score from that 2 or 3 spot, but some of them have been point guards. Some of them have been pure point guards who just run that 1 spot, and so maybe that's something they want some more depth there going forward. But even if they don't, even if they just prioritize other spots in the transfer portal, even with Wendell Green gone, I think bringing in Aiden Holloway, having Trey Donaldson as that backup, Auburn is more than fine for next season at the point guard spot. So I'm Nathan King. Catch you guys over at auburnundercover.com. Thanks so much for listening.